So welcome, everybody. Really very glad to have you here. This is a topic that I'm Howard Ross, by the way, and welcome. I'll introduce my colleague, Allyson Robinson, a little bit more in just a moment. We're just really pleased to be able to offer this to our shared community out here. We know that over the course of the last couple of months, this issue of transphobia has exploded into the public conversation, particularly obviously stimulated by the HB2 bill in North Carolina and similar bills in other states as well. And as with a lot of issues, what this has done is it's surfaced some deep feelings that have been around for a long, long time and that affected people for a long time. And so we're offering this as just an opportunity to hopefully to help people have a better way of dealing with a critically important issue. So thank you for being here. I am the founding partner of Cook Ross. And I'd like to introduce my colleague here, Allyson Robinson. Yes, it is the same person, despite her chameleon-like hair color shift here. Allyson and I have known each other for almost 10 years. We met when you were leading the transgender initiatives at the Human Rights Campaign, and I was on the Diversity Advisory Board for the Human Rights Campaign. And Allyson has graced us with her presence here at Cook Ross now for the last couple of years as a senior consultant. So we're really pleased to do this with you, Allie. And,
you too. Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks for being here. Just a little bit, I'll toot Allyson's horn a little bit. She's got a lifelong, profound experience, not only her personal experience of dealing with these issues, but also as a leader in the field and somebody who has really created a constructive dialogue around these issues in so many contexts, in the military, when you're in the military, and in the ministry, and lots of other things. So just so happy to have you with the company and also to doing this with you.
Thank you, Howard.
So I don't know if there's anything you'd like to say, just to say hello.
Yes, it's great to be with all of you today. So excited to have so many of you from all over the country joining us today for this important conversation, particularly as we're also marking the International Day Against Homophobia, Transphobia, and Biphobia. So this is just one small contribution to a global conversation today about addressing these issues in our communities and in our society.
I guess we just have good karma, because when we set this date a couple weeks ago, we didn't realize we were setting it on this day, but it couldn't be more perfect. So let's jump into the conversation just quickly about Cook Ross. Cook Ross was founded in 1989, so this is our 27th year of business. We're a certified women-owned organization based in Silver Spring, Maryland. And we do work in organizational culture development and transformation, leadership development, and diversity and inclusion. And of course, some of you are probably familiar and have probably joined us for work that we've done in the past on unconscious bias, which is a particular area of specialization. I see by looking at the names that some of the folks who have joined us today also joined another webinar that we gave a couple of months ago on Islamophobia, and we plan on continuing to do these free seminars for the community to continue to expand people's consciousness about these very, very important issues. We've got 30 full-time staff here, most here in the DC area, although we have some around the country, and 25 additional consulting associates who we regularly engage with around the world, and that's a continuing growing field. So we're glad to be here. Also, by the way, you'll notice the hashtag at the bottom left of your screen, which will appear regularly during the presentation, @NoMoreTransphobia. And if you care to tweet about that, get some of the information out to people, the more people who know about this information, the better. So let's first talk about what's going on. You know, what's the reality that we're dealing with relative to the things we hear and the things that we see? Transphobia, like so many other things, is an issue that is filled with misconceptions. So let's look at some data. Here's one. More than 2/3 of hate violence homicidal victims, transgender women of color, yet transgender survivors and victims represent only 13% of the total reports to the National Conference Against Violence Programs, National Coalition Against Violence Programs, rather. Transgender people were 7 times more likely to experience physical violence when they're interacting with the police, which can be a barrier to accessing critical support in the aftermath of violence, and places transgender people at greater risk when they do experience violence. And I think this is one of the things, Allyson, that people don't really understand, the multiple layers of this, because not only do transgender people experience more criminal attacks, violence, hate crimes, things like that, we'll see more about that, but the fact that police often are just as violent towards transgender folks as the other people means who do you go to for help when something like that happens?
Yes.
And so there's no question that these statistics are, even as high as and as ghastly as they are probably underreported.
Very true, very true.
Yeah. Okay, let's see. Transgender women, 1.8 times more likely to experience sexual violence than straight women. Excuse me, our computer is now doing its own thing. Sorry about that. I have no idea why that's happening, but we'll try to use the keyboard. That'd be better. Thanks. And according to the FBI hate crime statistics, in the last year, there's been a threefold increase in violence and threats against transgender and gender nonconforming Americans. Now, this is so important for us to realize, because often people look at an issue like what's happening in North Carolina, and what you hear people saying all the time is that this is, often I should say, is that this is a problem or a solution with no problem. And of course, that's only because we're not aware publicly about how deep the problem is. Now, for people who experience this problem every day, that's got to really great to hear people say there's no problem. It's just if it's out of sight, it's out of mind, I guess.
Right, absolutely. And of course, as we're going to see as we go on, I think often if a problem is perceived, it's perceived in exactly the opposite way that it's occurring in reality for real people who are dealing with these issues every day.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, this doesn't even include things like going to doctor's offices and having people making assumptions that what's going on with your health or sexual issues when it has nothing to do with that, but because people know about the sexual identity issue, they automatically are pulled in that direction, and hundreds of other examples as well. Good. 70% of transgender people say they've been harassed, and a few even assaulted when using a public restroom. Get that number, 70%. That's pretty staggering. And of course, we're talking now about the more obvious ones, but transphobia also occurs as various kinds of micro-inequities. Here are just a few of them. We'll just silently watch these on screen. And when we see these kind of micro behaviors, they occur every day in conversation. It's important for us to recognize that most of the time, micro behaviors don't occur intentionally. This is one of a little bit of the challenge we have with the language microaggression. It's not that conceptually there's any question about that, but sometimes it's confusing to people because we think of aggression as being a conscious thing. And of course, most of these things, somebody comes up and asks you, the most private questions about things like surgery, and doesn't even occur to them, forget the transgender dynamics in that, it doesn't even occur to people how incredibly intrusive that is.
Right, sure. And in fact, for some, sometimes it can even seem as though it's a compliment, right? Yes. Someone saying, I would never have known that you weren't born a girl, exactly. Right? That is offered with the best of intentions, the purest of motives, and nevertheless can reinforce this dynamic, this normalcy dynamic that you're describing.
Right, and of course, when not even looking at the fact that even in that question is a lack of understanding that, as you'll share with us, in your inner world, you were born a girl.
Yes, right.
So this is a factor. So micro behaviors tend to endorse stereotypes, challenging the normalcy of transgender identity. This is, are you this or are you normal, which says what? Citing practices as either deviant or sinful, as certainly some people do. An assumption that all trans people are dealing with the same kinds of issues when, of course, like any other issue, people are dealing with any number of things. And there's also, as we saw even in those statistics, the intersectionality of things like race or socioeconomic status or other factors, even sexual orientation, that are all factors in this as well. And then the denial of prejudice, of course. So it doesn't bother me. I don't mind that you're that way. I just think that it's better for privacy purposes and things like this. And so all of this creates a deep underlying anxiety, almost like a condition, a stress condition, almost somewhat akin to post-traumatic stress disorder, where we're all carrying this stress, and the more public it becomes, the more the stress occurs. And this is not only in places like North Carolina, where it's now part of the public conversation very loudly, but of course it also shows up in the workplace as well. Now, one of the things we did in preparation for this is I went online and found a whole series of quotes, and these are actual quotes from people who are using it to justify things like the HB2 law. And it's really fascinating to look at these quotes because we can see in this the fundamental irrationality that we bring to it. Here's the first one. I'm not a fan of using a washroom that's also used by men. Their washrooms are dirty and disgusting. So now what's the assumption here that if we're going to allow somebody to come into the bathroom who's a transgender woman, for example, that they're going to bring their manly slovenliness with them? I mean, it's just, it makes no sense, and yet it's one of the things that people say. Here's another one. I'm tired of all the talk about gender and transgender. Why should the world have to adapt to this tiny minority? And particularly here in the United States, of course, we can give hundreds of examples of times when we recognize that minority rights are in fact the most important part of our democracy. In fact, I think Thomas Jefferson said that if we don't protect minority rights, we don't have a democracy. And so the size of the minority isn't so much of an issue, of course, as how we feel about it. It's too expensive to designate bathrooms as gender neutral. Well, once again, I think a couple of reactions to that. First is that since when is expense the only thing we consider in terms of people's human rights? And the second is that in a lot of cases, the only reason it's expensive is because we've created bathrooms in the structure we have them today. Right. If we actually had bathrooms that were set in different ways to accommodate, as you see many places in Europe, some of you have traveled in places in Europe know that they have open gender restrooms where everybody has a private stall, and it works like that. I guess any old watchers of Ally McBeal probably remember that as well. These transgender people are deviants. We shouldn't be accommodating their deviant behavior, and obviously there's not much to say about that other than to be offended. Men will use this as an excuse to prey on girls in a girls' bathroom, and this is one I find fascinating. First of all, the percentages, the numbers of times that's happened is so minuscule, it's almost hard to find any examples. In fact, most of the examples that are cited are not examples of anybody doing anything. It's examples of people being freaked out by the fact that somebody even showed up. The second thing about this, though, that's of course important, is that a person doesn't need to be transgendered in order to put on a wig and clothing and make themselves look like a woman if they want to get into the men's bathroom. So as a straight heterosexual man, I could do that same thing if I was interested in preying on girls in a bathroom, and the fact of my gender identity has nothing to do with that. Right. So again, there's no rationale there. We're making the rights of predators more important than the rights of children. Now, what are the rights of children here if they're not actually in danger? And then the last one, there'll be a serious loss of privacy, and once again, ironic, because all we need to do is have, booths to go in, or whatever it is. Stalls. Stalls, right, thank you. I couldn't find the name. Stalls to go in. So all of these things are factors. And of course, the last one, which is at the heart of it, and that is it's just not normal. And this is important for us to get, that if we look at any one of these arguments, they really don't hold water for any real rational conversation. But what they really point to is something much deeper, and that's what we call the yuck factor. And that is, I just don't feel comfortable with it, therefore get it away from me. Therefore, I don't want to see it, I don't want to deal with it. All of the challenges that we have with this can be easily dealt with, but the problem is, because it feels so unorthodox to us, it feels so alien to many people that we have that reaction, and this is, of course, the real challenge. So it causes us to have a reality check. When we look at this data and we look at the danger that transgender people face on a daily basis, when we look at the feebleness of these excuses, the question that we have to pose is, as a society, we've treated transgender people like they're threatening, but the truth is, the reality is that they're the ones who are being threatened. And so what we want to look at now is how does that play out relative to the experience, the lived experience of people.
And so this is the point where I wanted to share just a little bit about the lived experience of transgender people, and much of this, frankly, Howard, is based on my own experience as a transgender woman, but also the work that I've done over, as you said, just over a decade now as a sort of a national advocate for transgender civil and human rights, working with government, working with corporations and other large institutions like schools and religious denominations to help them understand the experience that is at the heart of all of this, so that we can disentangle myth from fact here. One of the things that makes that makes this so interesting is that we have, for many, many years now, talked about transgender people in the context of a broader community, the LGBT or lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender community. This acknowledges a certain difference and a certain shared history, but often it masks some real distinctions between lesbian, gay, and bisexual and transgender people, or what we might think of as minorities of sexual orientation, lesbian, gay, and bisexual people, and transgender people, minorities of gender identity. All of us at this point, I think, are probably accustomed to having lesbian, gay, or bisexual people that we know come out to us or come out in more public ways. And this, by itself, shows us something that's often overlooked, right? That being lesbian or gay or bisexual is or can be largely an invisible sort of a characteristic. That's what necessitates the coming out, right? I'm becoming visible by my choice, often and under the best of circumstances. What makes the transgender experience different is that for many of us, in fact, for most of us, that visibility it reaches a point at which it's not a choice, right? During the period that we might call transition, for those of us who move from one type of expression to another, those differences become very visible, and they're often very visible not just to the people that we choose, but visible to everyone, right? And so, you know, the experience of transgender people in our society is a little bit different for this purpose. There are real implications for our relationships, whether we know whether a close relationship with someone or not. So to dig into some of those, let me, oops, there we go.
Sorry.
We're doing it again. There we go.
Okay.
All right. So let me ask you a question. We'll allow this to, there we go. Okay, I think we got it. So this is a question for you, Howard.
Okay, great.
I want to think, if you think back in your own past, see if you can remember a time when somebody reprimanded or corrected you for doing something that they perceived to be inappropriate for your gender. Can you remember something like that?
Yeah, it's called my whole childhood. No, I mean, I grew up at a time when gender norms were very, very clear, and so I remember, I had two sisters, and I remember playing games with them, whether it was playing house or if they were playing dolls, and as a little boy, I would just do what my sisters were doing because we were around, and my dad coming home, one memory sticks in my mind, and he wasn't harsh about it. He was saying, "That's not really for you. Let's go do something else,"
right.
And steering me in the right direction. And I certainly remember when I was in school that also seeing that in different people, that when there were girls, for example, who were good athletes. I remember there were two girls in my class who were particularly good athletes, and it was always fascinating in elementary school when we would have things. In those days, we did square dances in elementary school, and how all the boys would run to these two girls because it felt safer than because we could things like that. So it was really, I think, a part of growing up.
Yeah.
It's just more the norm than the exception.
Oh, right, sure. Yeah. And the fact that we are, all of us, so steeped in those norms. You used language just a moment ago about in terms of being with your sisters and playing dolls, for example, and being steered in the right direction.
That's right.
Right, deeply steeped in our understanding of ourselves and the world. When someone like your father, for example, corrected you or reprimanded you, how did that feel? Can you recall feeling what that felt like?
I mean, I think it was more just, I don't remember feeling, because like I said, my father wasn't really harsh about it, and I know people who would, people, don't you dare do that, and, I'll show you what you're, that sort of a thing. But I think for me, it was more, oh, this is where I belong. Mm-hmm. It was this sort of sense of belonging, and the homophobic and transphobic nature of that begins to get embedded, so that if we still see it in the way of jokes that people have,
sure.
Oh, is that your man purse? Somebody will say if somebody has a carry bag or something like that, which is, very thinly disguised homophobic or transphobic behavior, and yet we don't think much about those jokes.
That's a great point. Yeah. I would presume that that you very quickly kind of stopped
Yeah,
doing that.
absolutely.
Right, doing this.
Yeah,
thing.
this was right and that was wrong, and this got Dad's approval, and this didn't get Dad's approval. And of course, you always wanted Dad's approval. And of course, later on when I was a teacher, I remember I had a child who was a 4-year-old boy in my class because I started my career now more than 40 years ago as a teacher. And he grew up he lived in a family with a single mother and 4 sisters and an aunt who lived with that. I think the grandmother was also there. So it was this complete house filled with women and this little boy. And he would come in and he would engage with the things he played with at home. And his mother was almost obsessively worried about him because of that. And so it's this incredible dissonance between what people see demonstrated and what's okay versus the judgment that's associated with that.
Sure. And then how that goes on to affect our ways of being and our ways of thinking, right? Many of you that are participating with us online today can probably think of a time when you had this experience as well. And actually, I can too. So this is me, right? Somewhere between, I don't know, 2 on the left and maybe 4 or 5 on the right, getting ready to start kindergarten. So many experiences like this, but I remember, specifically being in kindergarten, being out for recess, playing my favorite game, which was chase. It's kind of the Olympic sport of kindergarten, right?
Exactly.
There's no rules. All we do is chase each other around, except in many societies, in many cultures, as I've heard of it in practice, it is actually a gendered game, right? Boys chase girls or girls chase boys. Now, I just knew when I was that little person on the right of this, the right photograph, that I was supposed to be on the chasees team, right? That I was not a chaser. I was supposed to be a chasee. How I knew that, it's hard to say.
Yes.
But I did. And so, kindergarten, often a liberal enough society, I was sort of allowed to be on whatever side I wanted. And everything was fine until the day that things sort of switched and girls chased boys. And, of course, what do girls do when they catch boys?
They kiss them.
They kiss them, right? And so in front of the big oak tree, in front of my little kindergarten, I caught one of the boys, and I did what all the other girls did. And I went home from school that day early, which is saying something, because kindergarten's only like 3 hours long, right? With a black eye and a bloody nose. And I remember, I remember my kindergarten teacher waiting for my mom to come get me, kind of cleaning me up, and saying to me with the best of intentions and the purest of motives, honey, you just have to remember, little boys don't do that, right? And I remember how that felt. I felt deeply ashamed. I felt as though I had violated some rule or law, and that I was living outside of the expectations of everyone. And I felt frightened. I mean, because I had those expectations policed on me in a very violent way. And so I did change my behavior. I didn't start playing with the boys. I just stopped playing entirely. I became the kid that sat on the steps during recess by myself, and it took me a long time to figure out what to do with that. I have asked these questions of thousands of people, and here are the responses that I hear from them. Number 1, I hear that these kinds of things are very common. They happen almost universally. Number 2, they start when we're very, very young. 3, the correction is often extremely harsh, disproportionate to, the simple behavior of a peck on the cheek, certainly, right? And then finally, these things become very, very formative for us. They shape the way that we learn and grow, and the people that we become. We change because of these experiences.
I think it's particularly, the point that you made that it's, I think, particularly important to underline is the contraction piece, that there's no place to safely engage, and so what happens is you disengage, you pull back and stop being yourself. And even for somebody who I know to be so gregarious and outgoing as you, to see that happen, I think is a telling kind of a thing, that when the world says there's something about you that's wrong, the natural place to go is in hiding for people. And I think this is particularly important for us to talk about in the context of the work environment, which most of our listeners are coming from, because that very same thing that has you sit on the step, as opposed to engage with people, when it shows up in the workforce, means we don't get your creativity, we don't get your innovation, we don't get your best self, and we have an employee who's underperforming, not because of her own, or his or her own, as the case may be, but because it doesn't feel safe to really fully engage, and so that there's a cost on the other side that we don't notice.
Very true. I think the other critical thing that this draws out for me, and one that many of you who are observing today probably already noticed, is that actually your experience and my experience are not all that different. In fact, at the core, right, this experience of having these expectations placed upon us and to a certain extent policed upon us when our natural inclination might have led us in another direction, right? In other words, my experience of gender as a transgender person, Howard's experience of gender as a cisgender person, a person who identifies with the gender they were assigned at birth, are not qualitatively different from one another.
Yes.
Right? They're quantitatively different, perhaps. But that's a critical piece, I think, for us to understand as we move forward.
Yeah, I think that the one place where I would say that there's a there are many places, but one particular place, even at that age, where there's a particular burden is in your relationship with parents. Because I think that for most cisgender people, their parents generally support who they are. Obviously, we know not all parents are supportive, and I'm not being Pollyannish about this, but mostly we get the support for being who we are. I think in the case of somebody who's a transgender person, often the parental, as I said with this woman who had her son, it's often the parental fear, and as a parent, you know, thinking either something's wrong with your child, or something's going to happen to your child, or something's wrong with you that your child ended up this way if you think it's a way that people should be. All of this stuff makes it, so there's really no safe haven in a lot of cases, not even within your own family.
That's very true. Yeah, certainly true. And all of this on the basis of what, right? On the basis of sex. But it's worth pausing to ask the question, what is sex, right?
Now, this is a different workshop that people probably thought signing up for.
You know, from a biological perspective, right? We're simply talking about a collection of or a particular expression of certain traits and characteristics, right? But we assign significant value to those traits and characteristics, right? I mean, think about it. In the moment that you're born, the doctor, your mother delivers you, the doctor or nurse or whoever's in attendance does sort of this quick scan to make sure you're okay, and then they say something.
That's right.
They say, it's a boy or it's a girl. And that assignment that happens there, which of course is given to you on the basis of very little more than sort of a cursory glance between your legs.
That's right.
Then goes on, you know, suddenly this cloud of glittery possibility that we like to imagine floating over every child begins to narrow just a little bit because so much of that child's future is determined by what is said by that doctor in that moment, right? I mean, you know, from the types of professions that one might be encouraged to enter, to the range of romantic partners that someone might feel free to pursue, right down to the color of the receiving blanket that you get wrapped in.
That's exactly right.
When they take you home the next day, right? All of this is determined on the basis of that assignment, which of course is not really an assignment of sex. It's really an assignment of gender.
That's right.
Right? And the distinction here is between sex as this set of biological traits, right, that we categorize in particular ways, to a set of norms and behavior. This is gender, a set of norms and behavior, and in appearance and in relationship. That we just sort of glom on to sex, but that we are learning, of course, increasingly are not necessarily tied to sex, at least in any organic way, right? In any way beyond the way that we sort of built society. That's right? Right. We've talked for decades about gender as a social construct for this reason. One other concept to introduce here is the concept of gender identity, and here's how I want to introduce it. I want to play a bit of a thought game with you.
Okay, good.
So let's imagine that I brought in with me a check for $1 million. Now, if I had $1 million, perhaps I wouldn't be here today, but for this purpose...
You mean you wouldn't keep doing it just for the love of it?
I'm sure that I would, actually.
Right, exactly.
So I've got a check for $1 million. I'm going to make this check out to you, Howard, on one condition, The condition is that as soon as we finish today, because we have work to do here, that we will immediately go to the nearest medical facility where procedures, commonly known as sex change, but clinically known as gender confirmation surgery, could be performed. You would undergo this series of procedures, and from that point on, you would live out the rest of your life presenting yourself to the world in the gender that is exactly the opposite of what you have been comfortable with up to this point in your life.
Right.
For $1 million, would you do it?
No, I don't think I would. I think I'm pretty comfortable with who I am, and but I could imagine that if you asked that question to people who are in dire straits, that would be an interesting question.
Perhaps they would.
Yeah.
That's a good question. Yeah. That's a good point.
But my guess is that most people, even faced with getting the money that they need for their families, to saving, any number of other things, wouldn't. And this is one of the challenges that people have when they say, sometimes I'll hear people say, and not just about this issue, but about many issues of diversity, well, the marketplace will handle it. If they're good people, they'll rise to the top. And what I'll say to people in response to that is, tell that to the people who wouldn't serve people in Woolworths back in the 60s. I mean, that was clearly they were turning money away. There was a clear financial incentive to do that, and yet something governs behind that. We're going to talk about that, these unconscious beliefs that we have that take us into these directions that rationally don't make sense.
Right. And the very fact that you wouldn't, and that so few people would take my $1 million, right, also demonstrates something else about you and about all of us. Because what I basically said is I can change all of this. I can change your appearance. I can change, the way that your reproductive organs are structured and so forth. But that just wouldn't be right for you. In other words, you have a sense of your own gender identity that is distinct from anything that's going on from the next gen, right?
Absolutely.
And this is this concept of gender identity. We all do. The difference, of course, between you and I is that there is a significant alignment between your gender identity and what the doctor said that day that you were born.
That's correct.
If the doctor, if I had been able to in that moment, I probably would have said, well, wait a minute, hold on, don't I get some say in this? Because I'm not sure you're right about that. So these three concepts of sex, gender, and gender identity are critical here because for many people, sex and gender identity align perfectly, like same color on the slide here. This is why sex collapses into gender for most people. They imagine they're the same thing.
That's right.
But it's not like that for everyone.
And I think that sometimes is confusing to people and is where people's resistance, they see this as a sexual issue.
That's right.
When it's not a sexual issue, it's an identity issue.
It's an identity issue, precisely. For many of us, as you see now here on the slide, our innate sense of who we are does not align with that declaration of our sex that was made on the day that we were born. But of course, earlier, you told me about a traditionally or stereotypically feminine behavior, playing with dolls, that felt completely natural to you as a child, that you didn't need to be coerced into doing it. In fact, you had to be told not to do it.
That's right. I was told very early that wasn't what you do, that's what she does.
So maybe this model is actually a better model for all of us, not just for people like me. Every one of us who, in some way, have a natural inclination that doesn't quite align perfectly with the set of norms and expectations that attach to assignments of sex in our society.
It's funny because I just flashed to another moment when I was teaching years ago, and because when I was teaching, and I graduated from college in 1968, and so I was teaching in the late 60s and throughout the 70s, and in those days there was a lot of experimentation going on with how do you degenderize the classroom, and so get girls to play blocks and tell the boys it's okay to play with dolls. And one day one of the boys was there, and he was playing with somebody, and somebody had brought in one of these dolls. It's like sort of like a Barbie doll kind of a thing, and he had bent the doll over in an L shape and was using it as a gun. Bang, 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 bang. It's like it's like you can change what's outside, but it's a lot harder to change what's inside.
Exactly right. Yeah. And we'll in fact see that, because in order to really get to a descriptive model of human gender, we need to actually take this apart just a little bit more.
Great, please.
So let's look at three different ways that we can think about gender.
By the way, before we go here, Allyson, I just want to tell folks that we do have a chat room open, and if you have questions, please feel free to put your questions into the chat room. and they'll show up. Just you can put them either to all attendees or directly to my name, Howard Ross, directed to us. And we'll take those questions as much as we can. We'll also have a period at the end if you have questions. So if you do then, you can jot them down, and we want to do as much of that as we can before we finish up. And if we do have more questions at the end that we don't get to, we'll also write answers to those and email them out to you as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
As well as, by the way, a portion of the PowerPoint so that you can have that information.
Terrific. And I'm also right here following along on both the hashtag and on my own Twitter account, which is at Allyson Robinson. If you have questions and you would like to you'd like to address them there, we may be able to address them live as they pop up on our stream.
Great.
Yeah.
Good.
So 3 different ways of thinking about gender here. We can think about gender identity, which we've also already described, our innate sense of who we are as it relates to the norms and expectations of our society. Then there's gender expression. That's what's on the outside. It's how I dress, but it's also my mannerisms. It can also be things like activities and hobbies, if those are sort of gendered in society, like playing with dolls or playing with trucks, can be, right? And then finally, there's this concept of gender assignment, right? So, you know, for gender identity, I have this is me looking in the mirror at myself, right? This is who I know myself to be. Gender expression, that's my Facebook profile picture. You know, this is how I want the world to see me. And then finally, gender assignment is what other people see when they look at me, right? So each of us do this, right? Every other person that we see, in fact, our brains do it subconsciously and very quickly.
Oh, yes. We know in a matter of milliseconds, actually, that you know, people who study this concept we call thin slicing say that we make determinations about people in less than a second.
Yeah. And here, in fact, it would go even beyond perhaps knowing, we know, but we assign, right? In much the same way that the doctor makes an assignment, we ourselves make an assignment because we assume that certain traits or appearances align with particular identities.
That's right.
And as we've seen, that's not always the case.
Absolutely.
So we can think a little bit about this on a spectrum now, right? We don't have to think about gender as a binary. You are either male or female, man or woman, but rather we see that there is this range of ways of expressing ourselves. So it's kind of fun to do this with famous people sometimes.
Yes.
So I throw up 3 pictures of relatively famous people. There's Arnold Schwarzenegger, Anne Hathaway, and Tilda Swinton, some of my favorite actors. And we can think a little bit about where we might put them on this spectrum, right? So where does Arnold go?
I would say pretty far left.
Yeah, Arnold probably goes way over here.
That's not politically. I'm talking about on the spectrum.
Yes, right, of course.
Right.
And then Anne Hathaway.
Probably more to the right.
Probably over here. Tilda Swinton, one of my very favorite actors. You know, maybe somewhere around here, maybe more in the middle of this spectrum. But even in doing this, we kind of have to acknowledge that we're making some assumptions.
Exactly right. Absolutely.
Because the fact is that what we're really doing is assuming that their identity aligns with the way that they're presenting themselves to the world.
Exactly right.
What is their real? We don't know, unless you're personal friends with one of these people and can ask them. We don't really know. And we do this all the time, as I said. Now, where this gets really interesting is when we begin to recognize that we can actually place identity and expression and assignment in different places on this spectrum, right? So, for example, think about an example similar to the one that you offered. You know, someone who was assigned sex female at birth. Their identity more or less aligns with that, but they every once in a while are just naturally inclined to some behavior or way of being that others would think of as masculine. Right?
And I think that also speaks to something that's really important for us to understand, which is that we deal with these issues as if they are dualities, that you either are this or are that. And I think we have a tendency in our culture to do that in general. We often take issues which are much more of on a continuum, and we say at some point you're this or that. If we look at it relative to sexual orientation, for example, we know that people have various levels of heterosexuality to bisexuality to same-sex orientation, and yet we draw this line and say you're either straight, gay, or bisexual. And that in and of itself can create some of this mischief because you have to choose something that really isn't clearly designated in that way.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Very true. So with this kind of experience, you know, what we I've highlighted here for you on the slide is the gaps, right? There is a gap between where other people are assigning my gender, way over here, or this person's gender, way over here on the right, where they identify, and the way that they're expressing themselves. They're expressing themselves in a way that aligns with their identity, but the assignment that others are making are different. That creates these gaps, and much like the gap that you talked about when you talked about playing with dolls with your sisters, right? And the way that we, that can often create, whether it's a low or a high level of anxiety within us, right, depending on how that correction comes and from whom it comes. And we have to cope with that anxiety in some way.
And by the way, it's interesting because I was just thinking about it, and it's interesting how it go both ways at the same time, because my younger sister, who was only 20 months younger than I was, would often hang out with me, and if I was playing ball or something, she would be doing that, and she might get the same feedback. Why don't you go play with your girlfriends?
That's right.
Don't hang around with him and his boyfriends, because that was, so this is social engineering that's happening all the time in both directions.
It absolutely is, and we are almost all of us participating in it all the time, right? So these gaps that create this sense of discomfort that we have to sort of cope with. So we can cope with that by, well, let's see, we could change the way that we express ourselves, change our outward behavior. That closes the social gap. But notice it creates a wider gap between identity and expression that then has to be coped with as well. And for some people, that might be, like, I can live with that, right? So think about me. Think about where I might place out or might have as a, as my 5-year-old self here. You can tell by those pants that there's a fashionista just waiting to burst out of that kid, right?
Either that or Herb Tarlick,
yes, right,
ad salesman, right?
Perhaps. So I knew my eye there, right, way over to the right. I knew who I was. Some of my earliest memories are just about recognizing that I was a little girl and not being able to figure out why everybody around me seemed to have a different set of expectations for me. I naturally sought to express myself in those because it's who I was. But that A, way over on the left, right, as soon as that doctor said it's a boy, suddenly that created an entire set of expectations for, my parents, my grandparents, my aunts and uncles, my teachers, my neighbors, every other person that I met. And now notice the gaps. And notice how much bigger they are, how much bigger those gaps are than they were in the situation like yours that we described a moment ago.
Right, absolutely.
That's a key distinction here. Bigger gaps, more discomfort, right? And that sense of discomfort has got to be dealt with in certain ways. So I'll tell you how I dealt with it at first. Here's what I did. I tried to express myself in ways that aligned with what everybody in the world expected of me. I was a Boy Scout. I played football in high school. I butched it up in every way that I could imagine. And before long, people forgot that I'd kissed my friend Scott on the playground in kindergarten, right? But I didn't. Because, see, the gap that then creates, it closes the social gap. Now I'm getting along okay with the people around me. But my internal gap just widened. And what I discovered is, as hard as I tried, I couldn't live that way forever. That was not a healthy coping strategy for me, and it's not. For the vast majority of us who experience discomfort at that level, which we clinically call gender dysphoria, right? The experience of a profound discomfort between our sense of gender, our gender identity, and the sex that we're assigned at birth.
I think that one of the things that people don't understand that's really important also, and that I've learned from talking to you and others, is that that may be so deeply buried, that the sense of wanting to fit in may be so strong that people may actually deny their own identity, and that there's an incredible psychological cost in that. When we know something is true about ourselves and we're living our whole lives to cover that up, there is no out. We're never out in reality. We're never ourselves in public because we're living a lie and aware that we're living a lie, and the weight of that is just enormous.
And in fact, we are often not even out to ourselves. For most of my life, being transgender, identifying across the gender boundary for me, right, that was not something that I was. I did not identify with that. It was something that I did occasionally, right, when I was in secret. Or to be more precise, it was something that I was never going to do again, right? It was something that I just did and felt so guilty about, well, I'm never going to do that again. And so, you know, that we can hide these things not only from the world, but from our true selves, or from our own selves.
Yeah, I think I read one of the reviews of the Danish girl, for example, the Eddie Redmayne film that came out about this true story about this person who ended up transitioning and then dying from the surgery. And, you know, what they were saying was, yeah, but, you know, he acted like he didn't even know it. But I think that's more common than people realize, because we have a tremendous capability of denying to ourselves things which are painful, or things which are exclusive, or hurt us, or separate us from other people.
It's so true.
And that's in fact there.
What we've learned from, and that, you know, bringing up the Danish girl is a great example of the fact that, or a great indicator of the fact that this is not a new thing, right? We have actually been studying how gender forms and studying gender dysphoria in human beings for well over a century. The medical and psychological and neurological and increasingly genetic science behind it is very, very well established. It's not a trend or a fad. It is, in fact, much better understood than many other very commonly accepted medical procedures that are done every day, right? And that we would never think twice about.
That's why I think it's so important for people to recognize this is not a medical issue. This is a social issue. This is an issue of social exclusion in its fullest.
And that just leads me to say that the real a treatment strategy that is effective here, right, is not to shift expression to accommodate with the expectation. Rather, it is to shift it to the other side, right, to where I can express myself freely in a way that aligns with my understanding of myself, and then, you know, deal with the social repercussions of that, you know, both through the process of my own transition and through the kind of work that we're doing here today. I want to, just before I move on, address quickly, someone asked the question, what is gender dysphoria? Just to come back to that for a moment, gender dysphoria is simply the experience of a deep and prolonged difference between one's identity as it relates to gender and the sex that a person was assigned at birth. Right, and so it is, you know, this isn't just sort of a passing discomfort, but rather is one that that is profound and increases over time, and actually becomes debilitating for people. This is the diagnostic criteria that are established by the American Psychological Association define gender dysphoria in this way.
Well, I think we can see here the combination, almost the perfect storm, because if one has this kind of disassociative, you know, structure to their mind, they have to disassociate from who they are, and gender dysphoria is created, it can lead to things like depression, anxiety, withdrawal, you know, all of these social manifestations and personal manifestations of that, and even suicidal thoughts and all these kinds of things. But of course, if you think that the very fact that the thing that's making you upset is going to make people more upset with you if you share it, then, as you said before, you may not even, first of all, you may not share that the source of your depression is your gender dysphoria. Secondly, you may not even want to acknowledge to yourself that it's the source of that, and so that depression then has to be explained by other things which may or may not have anything to do with it. And so we can see how difficult that makes it for people to learn how to deal with these kinds of structures. Let's take a couple more of these questions we have. A number of questions around etiquette. You know, how do you talk to people about these issues? And we're actually going to cover that specifically towards the end, so I'm not going to respond to those right now. How do we talk about it, that sort of thing. Somebody asked, why do we refer to that as transgender rather than trans? And you want to speak to that?
Yeah, sure. You know, one of the interesting things about being transgender and about transgender communities in the world right now is that we have only just, very recently in history, arrived at a point at which we have enough power and agency as a community to choose the terms by which we're identified in the world. In other words, up to this point, other people have been choosing those terms for us, whether they have been, you know, a transvestite, which was once a clinical term, right? Or cross-dresser or transsexual. And so trans by itself, or often trans with an asterisk at the end, was designed a few years ago to be, you know, to be a term that was inclusive of this broad community of people who experience or express their gender in ways that don't align with social norms. That trans by itself, or trans with the asterisk, is starting to fade a little bit, and particularly with a younger generation of people growing into their own agency. I'm starting to see some press against that. For now, you know, what I would recommend is the use of the term transgender. It is quickly becoming the kind of the broadly in our culture the most understood term here. But as we'll see when we go on, what we're really going to recommend is that for individual situations, that we respect the language that others choose for their own identity.
Yeah, very great. Just another question from my good friend Marilyn Mosley, who's at Case Western Reserve University. Marilyn, thank you for being here. She said she's asking about intersectionality. We did talk about this just at the beginning, but it's important to reiterate that the experience of folks shifts depending upon other factors. So as I think I said earlier, being transgender and black is different than being transgender and white versus Latino versus other cultures. Being transgender and poor is very different than being transgender and wealthy. Being transgender M to F, male to female, is different than being transgender female to male. So all of these things are in fact factors. And we could go on and on, but there are lots of examples of what Marilyn's talking about here, and that is that it is absolutely critical that we understand that.
Just a quick stat for you, and Marilyn, thank you for raising the question. In a study of transgender Americans that was done 4 or 5 years ago by the National Center for Transgender Equality, they found that overall, transgender Americans were twice as likely to live below the poverty line as their fellow citizens. But when you broke that out, the crosstabs by race and ethnicity, the picture got much, much worse, right? So what you saw in those crosstabs is transgender Americans who were black, 3 times the national average below the poverty line, who were Latino, 4 times the national average, who were of mixed racial background, 5 times the national average. That's 35% of the mixed race transgender community living below the poverty line. So it is critical to acknowledge the issues of intersectionality here, and to recognize that what is usually taking place in those crosstabs is a multiplication of oppressive effects that create significantly worse conditions.
And then, of course, you go into things like health disparities that are caused by both people who don't understand the health implications and health providers who don't know how to help with that, and also the fear of letting health providers into the secret. And so all of these are there. So all of these are factors, and of course there are also direct factors impact on organizations. You know, when you have this kind of elevated stress and fear for employees, it increases sick leave, it impacts levels of conflict, it impacts levels of productivity. It also impacts talent management decisions. How comfortable do I feel with this person? You know, do I send somebody out with a client? How's the client going to respond and react? And these are conversations that you and I had from the very beginning when you were with us. And you know, all of these kinds of factors that around talent. Poor customer service, if we don't know the needs of our marketplace and the kinds of things that are out there, and limited business opportunities. And of course that doesn't even include the business ramifications that we're kind of seeing in the case of North Carolina, where large businesses and entertainers are refusing to accommodate, and so there's a huge cost in that as well. So these issues have a huge one, and then of course all of this impacts the bottom line in organizations. So we want to talk a little bit more about this as well. Somebody asked an interesting question. They said, if we're not able to ask these questions, how do we break down some of those stereotypes? And we're actually going to talk about, we're absolutely not suggesting that we not have conversations about this, but we will talk at the end when we get to the conversation about etiquette about some of the things that we can specifically do. So I want to talk about the other side of it, the xenophobia, the transphobia aspect of this, and what we fear. Now, we know that normalcy is foundational to human beings and how we see the world. We learn at a very young age what's right and what's wrong and how normalcy plays out. And that acceptance of normalcy is used to justify fear of the other, those who are not seen as normal, hatred towards the other, particularly that feeling of threat, a bias, as we've talked about already, exclusion, that is, only normal people can be here in whatever form that looks like, obviously lots of misunderstanding, judgments of people, as well as violence, as we've talked about. And we know a bit about the neurobiology of this. We can look at it. We know that we make these decisions. We see something out there through this background of experience we have. So when somebody sees somebody for the first time, their background experience of what is a woman supposed to look like then becomes juxtaposed as to what they see with you. What is a woman supposed to sound like, act like, that sort of a thing. And immediately in these comparison minds, we're making these comparisons, whether we like it or not, because most of this happens in milliseconds, far before we have any conscious attention. We know that we very quickly go to our faster emotional brain, the limbic system of the brain, and the brain instantly puts these things together. It's very much, to call it thought is, and some of you who have been with me before, I like to say to call this thought is like calling a jukebox thinking when you press E4 and then that song begins to play. It's that mechanical, stimulus response. Now, normalcy, of course, is in itself a self and culturally defined reality that shapes our background. And if we look back at history, just to give a few examples, some things that were considered normal were in fact an abomination in our view today. For example, 160 years ago, slavery was legal and normal in the United States. It was normal for a preacher to go talk to their congregation, give a sermon on loving thy neighbor as themselves on Sunday morning, and then go home and beat the slaves before lunch and think that nothing was unusual about that. It was normal to distribute smallpox-like blankets to Native Americans as a form of population control. 100 years ago, it was normal for suffragettes to be jailed for insisting on the right to vote. How hysterical can you be to insist upon the right to vote? There must be something wrong with you. And in many cases, also were perceived to be mentally ill. Whoops, I missed one there. Oops, sorry about that. Here we go. 70 years ago, it was normal for Germans to turn in their Jewish neighbors so they could be taken away to be exterminated or just to disappear and then move into their homes. And these were respectable citizens who were doing this. 65 years ago, people were regularly mutilated through lobotomies as a normal medical practice. 60 years ago, separate but equal was normal law of the land, and it was what we saw all over the place. And, of course, it was also, as late as 1974, normal for the American Psychiatric Association to qualify homosexuality as a socio-pathological disorder. And, of course, until 2013, the APA considered gender conformity abnormal and classified as a mental disorder as well. So this is not an unusual thing for us to do that. Now, we do have the capacity to watch ourselves and to be thoughtful about this, and it lives in the prefrontal cortex, the red picture up here. And this is the part of us as human beings that's quite remarkable. 4 to 5 times larger than other animals, 2 to 3 times more active. It gives us the ability to say, what made me think about that? And this is really where our work begins, is when we're asking these kinds of questions to ourselves. You know, how do we consider our thought? But the problem is that for many of us, when we have an issue that's as charged as this one, the reactive mechanism of the brain, particularly the amygdala, takes over. It's a phenomenon that Daniel Goleman, the person we most associate with emotional intelligence, called an amygdala hijacking. And what happens in circumstances like this, when an amygdala hijacking occurs, is that the system is bathed with a chemical release of adrenaline, epinephrine, and cortisol. It basically prepares us for dealing with the perceived threat. Now, important to notice, I said perceived threat and not real threat, because it doesn't matter to the brain whether it's perceived or it's real. To the brain, it's all real. And we know that that can lead us into several different places. Fight, flight, or freeze. We talked about that. You know, in your case, flight was the way that you dealt with that as a child. You backed off and pulled away. A desire for control or authoritarianism. When we feel uncertain, we look for some way to control the circumstance. Therefore, oh my God, we passed a law that now says people can't in the bathrooms. We have to fix this. Let's pass a law that says that they can't. It's a completely predictable response to that threat. And also this sense that this is permanent, pervasive, and everywhere. And so we get this sense that the very tiny percentage of people we're talking about are all of a sudden going to be in every bathroom in the world. And so fear makes people objectify others, simplifies our identity, and intensifies that sense of threat. In fact, it makes us irrational. And as a result of that, what happens is we look at a group of people when there's a real threat by a very tiny percentage of people, and we expand that threat. And this is true for any phobic relationship. We see this happening with Islamophobia today, for example, as well, that the real threat of a very, very tiny percentage of people becomes a perceived threat about all people like that. Because for the mind, it's actually easier to say, keep me away from all transgender people, rather than me figuring out who are the safe ones. And this is important for us to recognize that it's a way of us actually dealing with that.
And Howard, it is, as you pointed out at the very beginning, it is itself irrational in that from a factual perspective, you know, there just aren't examples of transgender people, you know, using these rights, which are fundamental, right, to our existing in society, to prey upon others.
Yes.
There are quite literally no examples, and if you look at the hundreds of municipalities and states where these laws have existed, many of them since the 1970s,
yes.
which is interesting to know,
yes,
right?
Really.
This didn't all start with Charlotte or with North Carolina.
Right.
For most of my life, right, the first of these laws were passed back in the 1970s. You know, if you reach out to departments of police and public safety and local governments, what you hear back from them consistently is we've not seen any of that,
yes.
right? So that perceived threat actually isn't even, you know, doesn't even adhere to trans communities.
Yes.
If there's a threat in bathrooms, then that's certainly something we should talk about.
Right.
But it's, you know, we're assigning that threat to a particular identity where it doesn't belong.
Exactly, absolutely. And the other thing that we know is that the sense of being excluded triggers activity in the same regions of the brain associated with physical pain. So there's a real pain to this. We're caught as human beings between two different poles. One part of us that has a capacity for mirroring and sensing what's going on with other people. It's really a phenomenon of the brain that we produce these mirror neurons, and it's part of being social animals. We can sense what's going on with others. And of course, this creates a sense of a phenomenon we call homophily, which roughly means love of same. This is what draws us to people like us. But we could see where it also, this very issue triggers the opposite, which is that because we also have a deeply rooted capacity to divide between us and them so that we know who we're safe with. And so when I look and expect you to be like I thought you were, and in fact you end up not being like I thought you were, that occurs as a threat to my system. And this is where xenophobia comes from, the fear of the other. And we're in a constant tug of war between these two things. And many people will tell stories about how many transgender people who I've spoken to tell stories about how they were in a momentary situation, they're talking to somebody, and all of a sudden they realize that the person might know.
Yeah.
And something changes energetically in them and in the other person when at that moment they determine that. And it is truly like going from one side of this equation to the other. And it's so important for us to recognize that these dynamics are there, because what research all around the world has shown, and these particularly talk about race, but other ones talk about the difference in identities in many different ways, is that the more different somebody occurs for us, the less likely we are to have natural empathy. And this is really, really important for us to recognize. So, of course, the most important question then becomes, what can we do?
Right. And I appreciate, I don't know about you, Howard, but I'm following along with so many of the questions.
I know, really.
Seeing, I so appreciate the bias to action. Please tell me what I can do about this, or please give me some specific advice about this particular situation or that. I also want to just acknowledge how much I appreciate your patience as an audience waiting for us to get there. Because the fact is that in order to get there, we have to ask ourselves another question. And let me just come back here to our slide, is what can we do to manage this within ourselves? We really have to start with ourselves and our own way of seeing and our own way of being to get to some good answers and some sustainable answers to the question. So I think we begin by simply telling ourselves the truth about our bias. that we all have bias, that to have bias is to be human. As I think I may have heard you say at one point, Howard, I love it, you know, there's no greater evidence that you have a brain and that it's functioning in the way that brains are supposed to function, that these bias processes are happening to us all the time. But we can take responsibility for the times and the ways that they happen and lead us to behaviors, ways of being and acting that are outside of our values and our aspirations for ourselves. And so some thoughts about this level of self-awareness. You know, recognizing that everyone's experience of gender is different, and therefore we're all going to bring a different set of lenses into this conversation with us. You know, being aware of how we're forming first impressions of others is critical, and tracking those things, looking for patterns in our impressions and in our decision-making around others on the basis of their gender or their gender expression.
Now, one of the things that we're doing in the work that we're doing, for example, with teachers, with educators in general, with police officers, is to get people to notice those first impressions. Because, you know, I was working with a group of teachers not long ago, and I said to them, if the best thing you can do the first day your students come into class is give them an assignment and then just start writing down while they're doing that what your first impressions are. It's a great kind of window into it. Got to watch out for that one. I've already labeled them. But in order to do that, of course, we have to get away from that guilt of feeling bad about our bias and recognize it is a natural process, and we need to manage that guilt response.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I am in this work, I'm increasingly asking people to look for patterns across behavior with people of different gender expressions. You know, do I feel particularly drawn to manly men and feel uncomfortable around men who express their gender in more traditionally or stereotypically feminine ways? Do I feel uncomfortable around people who present themselves as androgynous? Right? You know, for me, that was a pattern that I noticed in myself as a child, right? And that today I sort of trace back to many of my own struggles and feeling in a very personal way how important it was to do gender right? So much so that it made me uncomfortable around people that I perceived weren't doing gender right.
Yeah, and we're also so, you know, when you talked about androgyny, it was really interesting. It struck me that we're so inconsistent in our beliefs. For example, on one hand, we see androgyny as this terrible thing, and yet we've just seen with David Bowie dying and Prince dying that there's another part of us that's drawn to it. I mean, it's this fascinating sort of back and forth.
Yeah, very true. And really what we're asking you to do, we're asking ourselves to do, is something that's very difficult, and that is to explore our own feelings of awkwardness and discomfort. It's tough because, like, the dictionary definition of awkward is I don't want to go explore that thing. But one of the things that I've learned in being a trans person in our society is that I'm a lot like this. It's a Rorschach ink blot, right? And what I mean by that is that I've learned that what people see in me says a lot more about them than it does about me.
Right? Exactly.
And so, you know, if we find that we experience awkwardness or discomfort around particular ways of expressing gender or around transgender people, that's worth exploring to understand where it's arising from in ourselves. Right? This is the deep level of self-awareness that allows us then to move beyond and to choose decisions and actions and evaluations and judgments that align more closely with our goals and our values. So, you know, what we're talking about here is asking ourselves questions. What is it about this person that's making me uncomfortable? Am I being reminded of some person or some experience from my past? Am I making assumptions here? And is my discomfort perhaps focused around those assumptions or around them being proved false? Do I feel unsure about how to react or interact in a particular circumstance? This is so clearly the case. In fact, we see it reflected in so many of these questions.
It's so true, and I think that the key is to be able to separate between what we're seeing and our interpretation of what we're seeing. And of course, that's the real pathway to wisdom in life anyway, is when we begin to notice our own interpretations, as opposed to thinking that our interpretations are the truth, which is the way that most human beings deal with the world. We think that the way we see the world is the way the world is, when in fact we know that the world occurs more as we are than as it is.
Yeah, very good. So a couple of more suggestions for you here. Here's one: learn more about the transgender experience. I've spoken a little bit about mine today, and I've tried to speak in a general sense in order to equip you in a broader way. But as one of my friends, Mara Kiesling, who's executive director at the National Center for Transgender Equality, likes to say, when you've met one transgender person, you've met one transgender person, right? So, you can, begin by exposing yourself to positive role models, and there are so many today. This is so different from my childhood.
Right.
When, I was a young adult before I realized there was anybody in the world like me. Today we can point to so many people and talk about their amazing lives. This is Dr. Martine Rothblatt of United Therapeutics, founder of Sirius Satellite Radio, an amazing...
Whose company is one block from ours, by the way.
Headquarters, just down the street, right? My friend Cameron Partridge, the Reverend Cameron Partridge, Episcopal chaplain at Boston University, a lecturer at Harvard. Cecilia Chung, San Francisco Health Commissioner, a member of the President's Advisory Council on HIV and AIDS. I'm privileged to call Senior Airman Logan Ireland a dear friend, a security forces airman in the United States Air Force. This is him deployed to Afghanistan last year. Speaking of the military, here's Amanda Simpson, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Energy Initiatives, former Chief Test Pilot at Raytheon, amazing woman. This is Chris Mosier, who is an American triathlete, a member of the U.S. Men's National Duathlon Team, an amazing athlete, a transgender man. Here's Janet Mock. Some of you will have seen and heard of Janet, contributing editor at Marie Claire, former staff editor at People magazine, who's written a wonderful book here in this space called Redefining Realness. Kyler Broadus, attorney, civil rights leader. Here he is testifying before Congress, one of the first transgender people to do so.
A friend who served on the HRC committee
Diversity Committee with you, exactly. Some of you will have heard this just recently. This is Geraldine Roman. She was elected just last week to the Philippine House of Representatives, the first transgender person to be elected to the National Assembly in the Philippines. And then Jenny Boylan, my dear friend, New York Times best-selling author, op-ed contributor to the New York Times as well.
I just saw Jenny on CNN the other night, actually, talking about these issues. But, the other thing I want to say is that when we talk about exposing the role models, that doesn't only mean famous people.
Right.
There are many people. After Allyson and I met, for example, she was gracious enough to come and spend a couple of sessions, lunchtime sessions, with our staff, just answering whatever questions people had and telling the story. And I think that the more we humanize this, and the less we objectify people, and the more we humanize them, we give a story and a face and a name to people, the more we realize we're dealing with human beings. We're not dealing with another classification or species. Yeah, very, very true. A few more suggestions for you. We've talked about positive role models. How about some basic etiquette suggestions here? Here's just a few. I just grabbed these from GLAAD, G-L-A-A-D, an amazing advocacy organization that's doing very powerful work in this space. If you don't know what pronoun to use with someone, first listen and see if they identify themselves in conversation. If you still don't know, ask. I don't know about you. What a concept. Right. And yet, for many of us, because of the way we were raised around gender, it feels like this deep insult to ask someone, what pronoun should I use for you? Yeah. The fact is that people like me would vastly prefer that you ask that question. Well, I think the other thing is there's asking and there's asking. You could say, what are you anyway? Exactly. That's not what we're talking about. We're saying, listen, I want to be respectful, and I admit to being a little awkward about this, so I'd really love some coaching from you. I mean, there are ways we can ask this that are completely respectful and honor people, and then there are ways we can ask that's insulting. Yeah, and as I see a friend in the chat, Justin Davis has recommended, former colleague,
we aid the process when we set organizational norms that cause us to introduce ourselves this way. My name's Allyson Robinson. I use she and her as my pronouns. What about you?
Yeah, exactly. Right.
And we all share that, right? That honors the choice of everyone. We want to use the names that transgender people choose for themselves, and this is whether or not you know or believe it to be their legal name, or even, you know, I've often been asked, what's your real name? Right? My real name is Allyson. I've got a Social Security card and a driver's license that say that. But even if I didn't, we would still, you know, that's a basic extension of politeness that we would all expect for ourselves.
Yes, right? Absolutely.
Again, we've talked a little bit about terminology here. We want to use identity terms for individuals that people use to describe themselves, whether it's transgender, transsexual, cross-dresser, trans woman, trans man, gender queer, gender nonconforming, so many different ways that individuals identify. It's basic. It's Respect 101.
That's
to
right.
Respect those things.
And like with African American and Black, people have different preferences. The fact that you use one and somebody else uses another doesn't mean you're wrong or bad. It just means you use the different one that they prefer, and then you make the correction. Oh, I apologize, and do that. So.
Very good. Of course, be very cautious about confidentiality. If someone has shared with you information in confidence about their identity, unless they've given you explicit permission, then don't share that with others. And finally, we would never ask about someone's genital configuration or surgical status.
Right.
Most other spaces, we just know implicitly that that's out of bounds, right?
Yeah, I mean, you know, would you walk up to somebody and say, so, have you had a vasectomy? I mean, do you feel like, what kind of question is that to ask somebody, you know? And yet, for some reason, people feel in this case, and it's really, sometimes it's genuine curiosity, and sometimes, frankly, it's just purely an interest, you know.
I think so, too.
So we talked at this point mostly about what we could do personally, but we also want to talk about in organizations as well. So.
Yeah, sure. Just to wrap up here,
we have one more
you know, we recognize again that that each situation is unique. And finally, invest in building meaningful relationships with people who identify as transgender or gender nonconforming. I'm not really talking here about take a transgender person to dinner day, although I don't have plans, Howard. But finding these people in our lives, looking for people with whom to build deep relationships that allow us to understand the experience of others in a more authentic way.
You know, it really is amazing how much we are willing to sit with awkwardness rather than to find a way of exploring some of these things. You know, that we're so afraid of it feeling awkward to go over to somebody and say, you know what, I have to be completely honest with you. You're the first transgender person that I've ever worked with on a daily basis, and I would love to get to know you more and understand your experience, not because you represent all transgender people, but because, you know, at least I'll get some insight. And my guess is that most people would be thrilled to have somebody come up and ask that. And yet, rather than experiencing that those 20 seconds of awkwardness, instead of that, we live our whole lives awkwardly trying to figure out how to deal with these things, and it's a shame.
And miss the opportunity.
Yeah. So another thing is, you know, and this is true for all of us, is to not be a passive enabler of bigotry. We're around comments and jokes, especially now when it's in the public space like it is, when we've got this raging debate going on. And those of us who are in the dominant group, it's incredibly important for us to be the ones who stand up and say, wait a second, you know, I don't want you telling that joke around me. And you can find various ways to say that depending upon the relationship, or correct the comment, or whatever it is. But to take a stand that we're creating an environment for everybody. Within your organization, you can establish ways to bring awareness to people before they engage with employees, clients, or customers. I mean, one of the folks who I encountered years ago actually had reassignment surgery, came back to an environment that she was working in as a woman. She had been there perceived as a man, and walked in that day and said to this friend of mine who was working with her, all right, here I am. I'll answer any questions you want. And spent an hour or an hour and a half answering people's questions. And at that point, I remember my friend saying to me, and mind you, this was 20-plus years ago, it was gone. At that point, it was gone because now I knew I could ask or anything that came up. And I think that the more we create those relationships, the better. Put thoughtful structures in place that reduce bias. And so really watch, there are ways that you can build structures. We're doing a lot of this work now with our clients. So before you're going into a performance review, before you're going into a review process, before you're going into a hiring process, to put priming structures in place that remind you to watch where bias might play itself out. And this is important really for any bias, but particularly for biases that are as heavily charged as the issues that we're talking about with transphobia. To pay attention to the way transgender employees might be excluded or marginalized, and to look for those micro behaviors, those micro inequities, to look for the subtle ways that things might be communicated in ways that we don't realize, and to really consciously be on the lookout for it, noting that whenever we're in the dominant group, as I said before, we're not likely to naturally see those things. We're going to have to work a little bit harder to pay attention to those things, just like people are going to have to pay a little harder to pay attention to issues that we may have that they might not have as well. And then finally, to really be an ally. And being an ally doesn't mean taking care of them. It doesn't mean treating poor Allyson like she can't handle it herself. It means linking arms together and saying, this is a challenge for all of us, creating an inclusive environment in our workplace, in our schools, in our places of worship, in our society is a challenge for all of us to live in a safe and respectful community. And so it's as much impact on me in terms of the society I live in as it is for you, for example, Allyson. Now, the other piece of it is, in addition to this, is that you never know when somebody in your family or somebody you love or somebody you care about or somebody you work with is going to be dealing with the kind of issues, this tax that people have to carry. And so we may be creating an environment for somebody who's particularly close to us without realizing it. So before we wrap up, let me go over to the questions we have here. Let's see. Okay.
That's such a rich conversation.
Really, so many things here. And like I said, we will send the answers out to the back channel. But a lot of conversations I have at my company on diversity and inclusion are centered on metrics. What are some ways to do that as it relates to gender beyond the binary female or male to ensure that we're capturing employees who don't identify with either? Is self-ID campaign surveys the best way? Before you jump in on this, Allyson, I would say that one of the challenges with surveying, and this used to be more true around sexual orientation, and fortunately that's changing a lot in most parts of the country, although there's still some parts of the country where people are even afraid to ask the question. But it can be a real trap in terms of self-identification, because if the environment's not safe and you ask somebody to identify, you're in effect asking us to walk into the buzzsaw. Right. So we do have to respect the fact that people will not always self-identify because they may not be ready to do that.
Yeah, very true. And yet, I think that self-ID in this space is still it's still the best practice that we have for accurately identifying trans and gender nonconforming, and for that matter, LGBT people in our organizations. The effectiveness of self-ID relies upon climates and cultures of trust, and so anywhere that trust can be built, we know that we'll get better results from self-ID. One quick suggestion for building trust here is taking a look at the way that that you communicate internally, right? So, for example, if you use graphics, posters, newsletters, and so forth to communicate internally, watching how you present gender in those things, looking for ways. These are micro behaviors, right? That if they're not managed, can communicate a message out to us that that it's not safe for me to be open about who I am in this environment, even in an anonymous survey.
And even the way you ask the questions in a survey. For example, if you preface the questions by saying, we'd like to get this information for this purpose because we want to understand, and we understand this is uncomfortable to some people, and so it's totally your choice what to do. That can engender trust. It can make people actually more willing to answer the question. Yeah. So framing it appropriately. Let's see, a couple more questions here. I work for a clinic, and we're very welcoming of transgender patients. This is from Jamie Letter. You put it to all participants. The problem is that some patients are not. We've decided to allow transgender patients to use whatever restroom they prefer. I wonder how we can make our patients more comfortable with that. You know, this has been a challenge for, and particularly in healthcare, this has been a challenge forever. What do we do when a patient says, I don't want that African-American nurse treating me, or I don't want that woman doctor treating me, or something like this? You know, we're constantly at a pull between the biases of our clients or our patients, whatever it is, and the reality of our stand, our commitment to our own values. And my best recommendation to people in that case is to make it very clear in the environment through posters, through signage, that this is an environment that is friendly to all people. If you're uncomfortable with that, we'll be glad to have a private conversation with you, but understand that this is an environment that's designed to be comfortable for all people. And then to train your people to know how to deal with people's distress and upset about that. And that's work that we do regularly with clients, is to help coach people how to know how to interact with these kinds of issues so that they can take those conversations and conduct them safely and with confidence.
I think if there is a great suggestion here might be, I just called my own suggestion great. How's that? I haven't even made it yet. But if you have a single-use restroom in the facility, even if it's one that's not normally open to the public, to make that open for people who feel uncomfortable being in the restroom with a transgender person. You know, simply to say, we have a single-use restroom back here. That allows that person to manage their own discomfort without negatively impacting your transgender patients. And I think your staff modeling the way that you expect everyone to behave toward transgender patients in the practice. I think that's critical. Right? I think that sets a social expectation in that space that transgender people and as well as others will be respected here.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, there's an irony in this. We talked before about the irrationality of it, that of course, most of the concern you hear expressed is people going into girls' rooms, and of course, women's restrooms, rather, and of course, there are stalls in almost all women's restrooms. So the irony is that this is actually a more protected environment, and yet that's where people have its greater concerns. It just points to how rationality has very little to do with all of this. Let's take one more question before we finish up. And as I said earlier, we will respond to the rest of the questions and send them to you. But for now, let me see if I can pull one up here. There has been much discussion about workplace dynamics. Can you speak to how managers and trans candidates should enter into a partnership of support, including when or how to come out to team members? That's a great question, and this is a partnership. And ultimately, the question of when to come out really should be left up to the person, to the trans person who you're dealing with, because people have various levels of safety. Our responsibility as leaders, I think, is to create an environment that's safe for all people, that's safe for a broad diversity of people. And one of the things that I think is really important for people to start doing now, given that this is in the public sphere, is to start. The reason we do this, we offer this to people, is for people to start doing this. Now, obviously, we've only had an hour and a half here, and I know you probably already feel like you've been drinking out of a fire hose because we have so much that we wanted to share with you. But bringing this education into the workspace is critically important to help people understand what's true, what's myth, how all those things play themselves out, and ultimately to create an environment where all employees can feel valued regardless of their identity. And
I think it's important if you're a manager, I think it's important to recognize that you're getting on the train in the middle of the journey, right? Your transgender team member has been on this journey for some time, I could say more. I think what I would say is we would love to continue to have a conversation with you about how to build workplaces that are truly inclusive of transgender and gender nonconforming people, and we're going to have some contact information.
Yeah, we'll do that in just a moment. And I think that the other piece to that is if we're creating environments in which everybody is focusing on their biases in general, and transgender is offered as one of those, it also puts less pressure on this issue, and just realize that this is a human phenomenon. And as it says up on the screen now, in the end, the question we have to ask ourselves is which is going to win out, the forces of fear or the forces of decency? And it's really up to each of us to choose, which are we going to move towards. So just as Allyson said, we wanted to give you some Contact information, you can contact us at lookingforanswers@cookross.com or either one of us at our personal email account. You can see them here, howard.ross or allison.robinson. That's Allison with a Y at cookross.com. And 2 L's, yes. And also our Twitter handles at Howard Ross or at Allison Robinson. And we'd like to, feel free, please, if you have any questions, we'd like to hear from you. Yeah. Let me see if there's something, what is this? Jameson Green, who Jameson and I met years ago. I think you know Jameson as well.
Hi,
Jameson, it's great to have you here. I want to read your comment here. Somebody asked early on, what's the correct thing to say if you meet someone who's transgender? Should you not acknowledge the change to be PC? And he says, I would say it's not an issue of being PC. It's a matter of being respectful of another person. Whoops. If the person acknowledges their transness, then they're inviting questions. If they're not specifying clearly that they're transgender, then it's not appropriate to discuss, and your assumption that they are transgender could be incorrect. If you're aware that they are transgender because someone else told you that person is transgender, it's not incumbent upon you to acknowledge this, since they could also be wrong. It's best to simply treat all people with respect, and as you would wish to be treated. They would want to share something with you, they will. Jameson, that's a perfect way to end our conversation. I want to thank all of you. If any of you are interested in looking more about our work, you can see my 2 books are up here, Reinventing Diversity, Everyday Bias. Allison, so great to do this with you.
Howard.
Thank you so much.
It's
such a pleasure to work with you. And I can tell you personally, from my frame of reference as somebody who is committed to being an ally, that there's nothing greater than having partnership with somebody you can have real conversations with this about. So seek out people to have those conversations. If any of you have any questions or things that you didn't want to put up here but you'd like to have us answer, please send them to us, and we'll be sending you a synopsis of the presentation along with the answers to the other questions. Thank you all so much. We appreciate so much for taking the time to be with us at this really critical time.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.